Hi guys, this is our week 4 overview video, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about the poems and one short introduction, nonfiction, I don't know what you would call this, one other text that we're going to read this week, and then I'll go a little bit over the lessons that I want you to read through and study. Now we are in a new unit, so weeks 4, 5, and 6 are all about 1914 through 1945. We are shifting from realism into modernism. So you'll notice that the texts are changing, the poetry is changing, it's getting more, for me, even though this is not realism, the poetry is getting more real. But I guess what I mean by that is it's getting more concrete and it's getting more political. The short stories that we'll read are really, I don't know exactly what you would say, but as sort of as you see in today's time, as literature progresses, there are certain things authors can say more directly that they had to use imagery and innuendos and things like that for previously. So with this new period of time, we're looking at really authors who have the opportunity to speak their minds. We will absolutely read text. We'll read if you choose, a poem that I think in our last unit, 1945 to the present, we'll read a poem that certainly says whatever the author wants. I mean, there's no holding back there. So, of course, we're not quite there yet in this period between 1914 to 1945, but we are getting there. So one of the readings, I'm just going to go ahead and get started. One of the readings that you can read today is The Making of Americans. And it's not the whole book, it's just the introduction. It's about 3 pages. It's written by Gertrude Stein, and she's one of our expatriate authors. And so that's somebody who, from my understanding of an expatriate, is basically someone who chooses not to live in the United States anymore. And I don't think they haven't become citizens of another country. Like, they haven't given up their citizenship, I don't think. You guys could email me and let me know if I'm wrong about this, but they just live in a different country. So in this introduction by Gertrude Stein, if you choose to read it, I want you to know that she is being very purposeful with her grammar and with her sentence structure. It's very much a challenge. It's, for me, very confusing, and I have to read it extremely slowly. And definitely have a pen and definitely take notes. And that's how I feel about all of these texts, because y'all, if you've watched any of my videos and there's poetry, y'all know I do not like poetry. But with this, she is really using language to reflect human mannerisms, to reflect human emotions, to reflect human inconsistencies. And she's really trying to which is something that you'll read about in the chapter content. The writers of this time are really attempting to focus more on creative form in writing and branch out a little bit from the more traditionalist types of writing. So what I'm saying about Stein's introduction here is that for me, it's befuddling. It plays upon grammar and sentence structure and uses language to reflect Stein's perceptions on humans' reality and love. Our textbook says being American is one topic of investigation that threads itself throughout Stein's body of experimental writing. The other is love. And in all of the texts that we'll read in week 4 this week, you'll notice that there is a theme of America. Generally, it's negative or critical. Maybe not necessarily negative, but certainly critical of America and what it means to be American and what it means to be maybe even more of a what's the word I'm looking for? mainstream American. There's a better word for that. We're also reading To Elsie by William Carlos Williams. He was a physician, and he really attempted in his writing to reflect the true reality and almost the mundane reality of the things that he was observing. In To Elsie, he's it's not super mundane. He certainly has more mundane poems, but he's writing about his nursemaid Elsie, and so she was this girl who was an orphan, and she came to work for the Williams family and took care of the children. And I think that he's almost kind of musing on like where she came from and her past, possibly, or the past of women like her. I'm certain that the poem is about more than that, and I'm definitely curious to see what you guys have to say. Our textbook says, the simplicity of his verse forms, the matter-of-factness of both his subject matter and his means of describing it seemed to bring poetry into natural relation with everyday life. So, yeah, I mean, Williams is definitely trying to not make poems so, I guess, like, not put them on a pedestal, like, oh, it's poetry. It's just so highbrow and fancy. Like, if you can read and write poetry, you're just so phenomenal. He's definitely trying to get away from that. If you can, I'm sure you can. To Whistler American by Ezra Pound. So Ezra Pound is another one of our expatriates, and he also left the country. In his poem To Whistler American, he's actually writing to another expatriate. So Whistler is the last name of another expatriate. And for me, I feel like it's more ode style. Like, not, well, he seems to be praising this Whistler guy. And I think that, why did I say her? Excuse me. His. I think that he's representing his potential disgust with some social norms of American society, possibly, if you want to interpret it that way. You guys can interpret it however you want. Our textbook says, Pound first campaigned for imagism, his name for a new kind of poetry. Rather than describing something and then generalizing about it, imagist poets attempted to present the object directly, avoiding the ornate diction and complex but predictable verse forms of traditional poetry. So kind of very much like William Carlos Williams, Ezra Pound is also trying to be super concrete and very direct. So check this poem out. It's really, really short. It's not even a page. Let me know what you guys think. America by Claude McKay. I feel like this poem is somewhat of an oxymoron. Like, there are parts where it praises America, but this praise is probably done facetiously. And then, of course, there are other parts there where there's certain critical analysis, like in a negative way, of America. Our textbook says, McKay's radical politics rose from his belief that racism was inseparable from capitalism, which he saw as a structure designed to perpetuate economic inequality. So in this text, and if you read any of his others in the textbook, just to kind of get a frame of reference, you'll definitely notice that his poems are political in nature. There is no getting away from that, but they're short. This is probably my favorite poem of the entire selection this week, next to, of course, God, America, I by E. Cummings. For me, this poem is a play on the motto. I put a question mark here because I don't really know if you would use the word motto, but God, Country, Self, which I feel like is military based, but I can't confirm that. But I feel like it is. And I think he's certainly it's interesting because I think the poem takes a turn, purposefully, certainly. It seems to be very like Murica at the beginning, and then it's sort of like, no, this is this motto, God, Country, Self, so putting yourself last isn't really the best way to go about things. I think is sort of Cummings' main point here. But I think it's a great text, and he plays with form. And one of the things that our textbook talks about regarding E. Cummings is that he is going to reflect sort of, instead of the sound of the poem, he's going to reflect the visual of the poem. So our textbook says there's always humor in E. Cummings' poetry, and his outrage at cruelty and exploitation is balanced with gusto and celebration of the body. We don't have too much celebration of the body in this poem, unless you want to interpret it that way. Go ahead. Okay, so our last text is by Langston Hughes. It's Democracy. It's also a poem. And basically, I mean, so sometimes I don't like poetry because it's so straightforward. For me, this is so straightforward. And so when you guys are talking about Langston Hughes poetry, you know, it'd be really interested to see the questions that you come up with. Like, how can we dig into? Feel free to take a historical perspective here in terms of literary criticism, because certainly these poems are reflecting what's going on in America in the time period, and it's perfectly fine to ask questions about those things. And I know that that might not necessarily be like 100%. That might not necessarily be like 100% text-based. So just keep working on how you phrase your questions to elicit as text-based of a response as you can. So I'm starting this video back up a day from when I last stopped it, and I think I covered everything, y'all, but if you have questions about any of this stuff, just let me know. So I'm going to go in and talk about what I want you to do this week. So this week, in terms of your lessons, there's only 3 lessons. Usually I think you've had 5 or 6, but this week there's just 3. So look at week 4 vocabulary. It's a much shorter list than it has been in the past. It's like half the number of key terms. And then look at really the most important lesson this week is scholarly research and ProQuest. So in this lesson I talk about motives for writing, you know, like how you can find purpose for your own argument by looking at scholarly sources, by looking at what critics have to say about the work that you're looking at. But then there's also sort of a comment there that is like, if you're feeling overwhelmed, if you're feeling like, if you look at scholarly sources or secondary sources and you would not be able to distinguish your argument from the argument that's being made, then don't look at them right away. It basically talks about the benefits of maybe starting your research process early as opposed to just starting out contemplating your text, because maybe you can find someone's idea that you disagree with or that you want to qualify or elaborate on or something like that. It talks about ProQuest, which is the suggested database to use to search, because it gives students free access. You know, because you pay tuition at CFCC, you get free access to ProQuest, which has tons of articles, content, things like that for you. If you're looking for something specific, let me know. I can always help you. The lesson about scholarly research in ProQuest talks about Boolean phrases and how when you're using an academic database to search, you kind of have to search a little bit different than you do on Google. So definitely look into that lesson, and if you have questions, there's a lot in that lesson, so let me know. And then I have a lesson on choosing a text, so maybe some suggestions for you in terms of how to pick your text, because there's a lot. And then in that lesson, in choosing the text, there is a comprehensive list of all of the readings that we will have covered this semester. You can pick one of those readings. If there's something in the book that you would rather write about that I did not assign, you certainly can. You just have to kind of email me so we can talk a little bit about it, and I'll feel more comfortable, and I might even read it. Just don't pick like Huck Finn or something that's going to take me forever to read. Okay, so what else do you have to do this week? You have a quiz. It's just like the first quiz that you had. It's 25 questions. It's worth 50 points. It's a quiz on the chapter content for Unit 2. And then, as usual, you guys have a discussion board. So this week, you should be getting a lot of feedback regarding some of the assignments that you've turned in that I still need to grade. So be on the lookout for that. I'm going to be giving feedback, both video feedback and just feedback typed directly into Blackboard. Video feedback for your first paragraph response, probably not for your second because I'm a little bit behind, and then video feedback for your second discussion board, but probably not for your third because I'm a little behind. So I'm going to skip that and just get caught up for this week where you guys are working on reading about the texts about America. So email me if you have any questions, check all this stuff out, and I hope you guys have a good week.